All right, everyone. So I was reading up on this whole idea of removing qualified immunity, and I found this Supreme Court case that really just reveals why qualified immunity is necessary and why removing qualified immunity is just absolutely insane, evil, and destructive. So, there is a Supreme Court case that goes back to 2018. It is called District of Columbia versus Westby. And basically, what happened was back in 2008, yes, 2008, so ancient times, there were a bunch of lowlives in what was essentially a derelict house running a makeshift strip club. And there was loud music, and they were smoking dope, and they were drinking, and the house was absolutely filthy. Well, residents in the area called the police. They were complaining about the loud noise, they were complaining about all the ruckus, and of course, the police arrived. And one of the lowlives inside of the house looked out the window and saw the cops, and he told the rest of the scoundrels in the house, "Oh my God, the police is here, man, scatter." The cops entered the house, and there were 21 people inside of this house. They scattered. There was one guy hiding in the bathroom. They were all trying to hide like a bunch of rats. The police said, "Okay, you're all going to be questioned." The house was utterly filthy. Utterly filthy. It was seriously a giant mess. And the word mess is an understatement. There was filth all over the floor. There were condoms on the floor. There were no, it wasn't really a home. It was just a derelict house. There were metal chairs because people were watching some woman strip. They had a pole there, and they basically had a makeshift retail strip joint in this house. There was one mattress, no beds, but there was one mattress because people were banging some stripper or strippers, and it was just nasty. It was filthy. In fact, it was so filthy that there was one guy who refused to sit down on the floor while being questioned by the officers because the floor was just so disgusting. It was repulsive. And obviously, what these people were doing was not kosher. It was not legal. The cops were trying to find out who owned the house. And the people who were questioned, these lowlives, they were giving contrary answers, contradicting answers. But basically, two different people told the cops that the tenant of the house was some woman named Peaches. Okay, so this really gives us more of an understanding as to the depths of degeneracy that was going on in this house back in 2008. Some woman named Peaches, yes, Peaches, everybody. Peaches was the tenant over this house. So the cops spoke with Peaches. I don't know how you can take these people seriously, but this was the story. Peaches. And Peaches said, "Yeah, I'm the tenant," and blah, blah, blah. Well, Peaches confessed to the officers that she had no permission to be allowing what was happening in this house. So the officer spoke with the actual owner of the home, the landlord, and the landlord said, "Yeah, none of this stuff should be happening." So there were people who were arrested. All 21 people, all 21 lowlives were arrested, and later on their charges were dropped. Well, 9 years later, 2017. So the arrests happened in 2008, ancient times, a long ass time ago, everybody. I was probably still a senior in high school. And in 2017, several of the people who were arrested decided to do a lawsuit on the officers for wrongful arrest. Yes. So imagine this. You arrest a bunch of lowlives for doing what is obviously illegal. Running a makeshift strip joint in a house that doesn't belong to you, being dishonest to the landlord, running a strip joint in the house as a tenant. All right, obviously this was illegal. Obviously these people needed to be arrested. And the cops saw a clear-cut case of something that should not have been done, something that these people were doing that they should not have been doing. And imagine this, 9 years later, the lowlives come back and say, we want to do a lawsuit. And you get sued, right? Let's say you're the officer. Put yourself in the officer's shoes here. You make a simple arrest for something that is very obviously wrong, something that is a clear-cut case of people who need to be arrested and who need to be cleared out from a house that they're ruining and they're causing a disturbance. You arrest these people for a clear-cut case of wrongdoing. And 9 years later, they can come back and sue you. Well, obviously, the cops were qualified for immunity. Obviously, the cops needed to be shielded by qualified immunity. Because imagine being sued over arresting some bums, some dope heads, by these very dope heads 9 years after arresting them. So the case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. Imagine that, right? You arrest a bunch of bums, and then 9 years later, all of a sudden, their word is considered to be important against you, and they can sue you, and you have to go all the way up to the Supreme Court to decide something so obvious, to make a declaration on something so obvious. It's obvious what these cops did was right. It's obvious these cops were doing their job. It's obvious these people were bums and were doing something that was wrong. It's obvious these people were causing a disturbance and needed to be cleared out from this home. It's all obvious. But this is America, where the thug is considered to be something special, where the thug and the lowlife and the bum is considered to be superior to a police officer. This is America, and this is why this is partially the result of a bunch of people who got inundated and brainwashed by rap music, thinking that being a lowlife is cool and distinguished. So, but the case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And it's known as District of Columbia versus Westby. And Clarence Thomas came in, and he sided with the officers. In fact, all of the judges, Clarence Thomas, Kennedy, Alito, Roberts, all of the justices sided with the officers, with the exception of one justice, and that was Ginsburg. Ginsburg was the only one who said, no, the officers should not have qualified immunity. Because what happened was the District Court of Columbia, of D.C., told the officers, you are not eligible for qualified immunity. Yes. So the District Court in D.C. said, you cops don't deserve qualified immunity. You are open to a lawsuit from these lowlives. Imagine that. Just try to imagine how freaking insane this is. Imagine how insane this is. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit determined that these officers were not eligible for qualified immunity. They arrested a bunch of lowlives, and then 9 years later, they get sued, and the court in D.C. says, oh, yeah, you are open to a lawsuit. You guys don't deserve to be shielded by any qualified immunity. And the case has to go all the way up to the Supreme Court. This is why you need a Supreme Court, by the way, to act as a check against lunatics like this. Imagine that. And here's my whole point. Imagine if they remove qualified immunity in the whole country. Just imagine. You would have every loser, lowlife, scoundrel, sleaze bucket would be jumping up in joy, working to sue an officer for arresting them 10 years prior. And that would be considered okay by the lowlives, by the lunatics, by these evildoers, by these sons of Belial. That would be okay because cops are evil. Cops are bad. Imagine if they get rid of qualified immunity. If the If the court in D.C. told these cops, you are not eligible to be immune from a lawsuit. You are not eligible. You do not deserve. You are going to be deprived of qualified immunity for an arrest that for a lawsuit for an arrest that you did 9 years ago. Just imagine that. And this is a taste. If you look at this story, this is a sample of what it would look like without qualified immunity. Every loser, every scoundrel, every lowlife would be coming out of the woodwork to sue officers because the officers arrested them 10 years ago, 8 years ago, 9 years ago. And they want to sue for damages. And they want to sue and claim that they were wrongfully arrested. It's complete insanity. It is complete insanity. But if you look at the statement from Clarence Thomas, it's very, very educational. It's very educational. Clarence Thomas tells the court in D.C. that one thing that you failed to do, well, Clarence Thomas specifies a number of things that they failed to do, but he said one of the things that you failed to do is you isolated the facts. I like this terminology. You isolated the facts, and that's what all of these evil people do. Heretics do this. Heretics isolate verses. Heretics will take a verse, isolate it, and then make an entire doctrine on an isolated verse. Heretics do this sort of thing. Evil people always do this. They isolate facts. They take a fact, isolate it from the rest of the circumstances. They cut it off from its context. And then they use that isolated fact to justify all sorts of insanity. And Clarence Thomas tells the court in D.C., you guys isolated the facts and you did not look at the totality of the circumstances. This is another term that I really like, and I'm going to be using this a lot. The totality of the circumstances. You just took one fact and you ignored the rest of the facts that give you the whole picture. You see this all the time anytime people want to start a riot over an officer doing his job. For example, a police officer shoots and kills a criminal who needs to be shot and killed because the officer was defending himself and the criminal was trying to kill him. People will isolate a fact to stir up mob anger against the police. They will say, the police shot a man. Well, it is a fact that the officer shot a man and killed him. That is a fact. But what other things happened that led to the officer shooting him? They ignore that stuff. It's like that story with Michael Brown. There was some guy named Michael Brown. I think he robbed the store. A police officer showed up. Michael Brown was twice the size of the officer. Michael Brown was beating this cop. This cop had no choice but to shoot him because this guy was going to give the cop brain damage from the beating. And the cop shot and killed them. And people said, oh, this was a murder. He murdered this young man. No, he didn't. He was defending himself. He was defending himself. But they isolated a fact. The fact that they isolated was that the officer shot and killed Michael Brown. But the other facts were that Michael Brown was a criminal. Michael Brown was violent. Michael Brown was aggressive. Michael Brown was being extremely destructive. Michael Brown was being very, very violent. And the officer was defending himself. There was another case I saw where there was some guy who was going, I think over 100 miles per hour or something like that. He was going very, very fast. Officer stopped him and said, you were going extremely fast. You were driving at a very, very dangerous rate of speed, and you committed a crime. I think this happened in the state of Georgia, if I remember correctly. And the man was refusing to comply. He was refusing to work with the officer in any sort of civilized manner. And the officer then tried to arrest him. Well, the guy, of course, resisted arrest. The man was much bigger than the officer. And this criminal began to physically assault the officer to the point where he was choking the officer. And this man was very strong. He was physically very robust. And he was choking the officer. And the officer took his nightstick out. He was trying to hit the guy. I'm pretty certain he tried to tase the man. That didn't work. I mean, the guy was just going full out in his violence. And the officer had no choice because he was being choked. He was being choked, and the guy wasn't stopping. And the criminal was telling the officer, "Yeah, bitch. Yeah, bitch." I mean, it was just evil. It was just demonic. And all you see in the body cam footage is a little bullet cap just gently being tossed from his pistol, gently coming out of his pistol, because he had put the muzzle of the pistol against the guy's body and pulled the trigger. So because the muzzle of the pistol was against his body, you don't really hear the gunshot completely. So it was silenced, kind of like how a potato would silence a pistol. But the guy dropped to the floor, and the guy eventually died. Well, the family came out and said, "Oh, this was a wrongful killing." No, it wasn't. This was a clear-cut case of self-defense. But what do the people do? What do these low-life mobsters do? They will isolate a fact. The fact that they like to isolate is he shot the man. But what about the totality of the circumstances? He tried to reason with the guy. The guy wasn't reasonable. I believe he used the taser. That didn't work. He tried to use the nightstick. That didn't work. No matter what commands that the officer issued to this person was not complying, and the person became violent to the point where he was choking the officer. What do you expect the officer to do? Officer had no choice. He had used all the non-lethal options at his disposal, and his final choice, his final option, was to kill the guy because it was either him or the criminal, and he chose his own life, rightfully so. There are many cases like this. There was another case I saw, and in this particular case, they used the term totality of the circumstances, and I brought this case up in my last video. There was a guy who took his girlfriend hostage, and in fact, and I did not mention this fact in my last video, but he actually took his pistol out and he fired the pistol right next to his girlfriend to scare his girlfriend. Took his girlfriend hostage, took the baby hostage. Somebody called the police. At least one person called the police and told them this guy's got a gun. He has fired his weapon. He has taken the girlfriend hostage, etc., etc. All this stuff was taking place, and it was just complete chaos. The police pursued this criminal, and these cops were not normal cops. These looked like special forces cops. They had rifles, assault rifles, and their rifles had silencers on them. And they were pursuing this guy. They got him against a corner. He was still holding the baby. They told him to I think drop the weapon, because he did have a pistol at one point in time, although he dropped the pistol as he was running. The officers did not know this, and they shot him. Well, he was in a corner. He had already demonstrated that he was a threat. He had already demonstrated that he was violent, that he was destructive, and he had this baby in his hands. And the babies are obviously very, very vulnerable. They are completely dependent on adults for security. And so you have this monster holding this baby, and one of the officers pulled the trigger, and you just see the guy drop like a sack of potatoes. Obviously, he shot the guy in the head just from the way that he dropped, and the baby was rescued from this monster. Well, the case was reviewed, and it was determined that the officer did no wrongdoing, and the legal term that they used was the totality of the circumstances. The totality of the circumstances was not just officer killed a man. It also entailed man took woman hostage, took baby hostage, fired a pistol, had a weapon at one point in time, was running away from the cops, was still holding the child, was obviously a danger to society. And with the totality of those circumstances, the officers decided to take this guy out, and they were absolutely right. We have to look at the totality of the circumstances, obviously. But here is the point that I'm trying to convey to you guys. The point that I'm trying to convey is, imagine if officers had no qualified immunity. Let's go back to the District of Columbia versus Westby. These cops This was not a serious case. This was not a case of a man taking a baby hostage. This was not the case of a man committing mass murder. This was the case of a bunch of bums running a makeshift strip club in a house and officers arresting them because they weren't supposed to be doing that. The tenant wasn't supposed to be allowing that to happen. And the homeowner didn't want that to happen. So, clear-cut case that this was wrongdoing taking place. Officers made arrest. They questioned the people. They arrested the people. It was a very simple case, nothing complicated. 9 years later, they get sued, and the District of Columbia tells the officers that they don't have qualified immunity. They could be sued. They committed the arrest in 2008. Ancient freaking times, guys. Ancient freaking times. And then 9 years later, get sued. And according to DC, that was considered completely okay. According to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the DC Circuit, this was considered okay. And also, those arrested were awarded $680,000. So the bums were awarded a whole bunch of money, and the cops were awarded with no qualified immunity. That was their reward for doing their job. And you can say, well, the Supreme Court stepped in and sided with the officers. Yes, but why does the highest court of the United States have to be involved in something so obvious and clear-cut? That is the question. Why does the highest court of America have to be involved in making an observation that is so obvious? You know why? Because we live in America. We live in a nation of insanity. It's a giant... You know how they say Italy is a living museum? America is a living national insane asylum. That's how I see America. Go to public schools for the most part, not for the most part, but for a lot of public schools. Go to your inner city. For the most part, you're going to be seeing a lot of insanity. And I really don't... You see, if you look at debates between people who are pro-police, anti-police, or debates between people who are pro-qualified immunity and anti-qualified immunity, the people who are anti-qualified immunity come along and they say, well, according to the Constitution, and according to this case, and according to that case, and the people who are pro-qualified immunity come along and they say, well, you have to actually look at this Supreme Court case and that Supreme Court case. And everything is dictated by written law. Everything is dictated by code. We have become very pharisaical as a people. It's like what Jesus said, you guys worship the letter of the law, not the spirit of the law. I really don't give a damn about what the Constitution says or what some law said back in 1980 something. I really don't give a damn about any of that stuff. I care about principle. What is right? What is going to guarantee security? What will lead to the well-being of society? What will lead to an orderly society? What will secure and maintain civility? That is what I care about. I don't care about what the Constitution says or what some paper said or what some senator said 50 years ago or what some guy said in 1790 something. I don't really give a damn. I care about how do you maintain order in society? Well, obviously you need police officers. Obviously, you shouldn't be allowed to sue cops 10 years after being arrested for being 10 years after being arrested for being a lowlife running a makeshift retail strip joint in a derelict house. Obviously, this shouldn't be allowed to happen. But you have a bunch of people who love thugs and they love criminals, and they're basically like the girl that you knew down the road who always got banged by thugs, and she thought that thugs were cooler than men who were of civility. It's like you got a bunch of people like that running the country. That's what's happening. A bunch of people who they listened to Eminem and they thought that was considered good music. That's who's running the country. A bunch of people like that. And you got a bunch of people who just hate God and they hate civility. They hate anything beautiful. They hate anything good. And those people are doing this sort of thing. And it's just very, very sickening. It's just very, very sickening. I don't really care about what's written in the law. I care about what's good. And if what's written in the law is good, then I will support it. If what's written in a law leads to the detriment of society, then I don't give a damn. You can wipe your ass with it. I don't really care. People say that totalitarianism is bad or that dictatorship is bad. And I just look at, for example, the Syrian civil war. Do I want Bashar al-Assad, who's a dictator, or do I want rebels? I don't really care what people bring up international law all the time. And they'll say, well, international law says that Bashar al-Assad is a warlord or a war criminal. And I just look at the two different choices. I can either have Bashar al-Assad or I can have hundreds of thousands of people killed in a civil war. I'm going to choose Bashar al-Assad. Why? Because I care about life is too short. Life is too short to be allowing chaos and insanity to take over society. Life is too damn short. I want order in society. I want harmony in society. Do you know how many cops live in America? They are over 700,000 cops living in the United States. 742,000, something like that. And they are policing over 300 million people, 336 million or something like that people. That's insane. That's a very, very small percentage of the population having to do all the policing for a nation of hundreds of millions of people. That is insane. Now, imagine taking away those 700 plus thousand people, taking away those 700,000 plus police officers. It would be complete insanity. But that's what these people want to do by taking away qualified immunity. They're basically saying, hey, if you arrest some bum, he can sue you. So if an officer is going to have to fear getting a lawsuit over arresting a bum, not even arresting a serious criminal, arresting a bum, which cops do every single day. Cops arrest bums all the time. Imagine if a police officer is afraid to arrest a bum because he knows that 10 years from now, 9 years from now, I can get a lawsuit for this shit. You are going to hinder and impede the process of policing. And that is why this is so destructive and evil. And I absolutely, utterly hate it. And all of this movement against qualified immunity is just diabolical. It is. It's completely diabolical. Cops are fighting criminals. Cops kill criminals every single day in this country. Around 1,000 or so people are killed every year by police officers. And that means that cops are killing criminals every single day, multiple times a day. Imagine if you remove the police. Imagine if you hinder the police to the point where you have them afraid of arresting a bum because they could be sued 9 years after arresting the bum. Just imagine that. Imagine what that would cause. Because people will sit there and say, well, removing qualified immunity is not a big deal because officers would not have to deal with frivolous lawsuits. What the hell do you call District of Columbia versus Westby? This is the result of a bullshit, frivolous lawsuit against police officers by a bunch of bums who wanted free money. They said, "Oh, I got arrested. I want to get free. I'm gonna get some money," and they wanted money from the cops, and so they sued the officers over bullshit. This was a bullshit case. So imagine if they get rid of qualified immunity. You would have these bullshit cases galore. You would have a million women named Peaches wanting to sue the cops. But this is America, where the low life is considered to be something special, and the low life is considered to be superior to a cop. And this is America. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.